Okay, well, good morning, good afternoon to everyone. We are very happy to welcome you to the first class of the third module in the BRED PhD course. So this module is going to cover migration. We're going to kick off today by starting to talk about internal migration, and then I will give a quick run through of the other 4 classes that we have planned as well. Today, we're also going to have a featured speaker. Each of our classes is going to highlight specific work as well as give an overview lecture. And today we're very happy to also have Travis Baseler from Rochester, who's going to talk at the end of the class about his work on information frictions. And before I start, I also want to say a big thanks to Susan and all the other folks at IGC for helping organize and coordinate and get this all set up. Okay, so to start off with, I want to put these 2 figures up and just think a little bit about what these figures might mean. If you are someone living in Indonesia, thinking about where to work and where to live. So the picture on the right, we see people in rural Java working in agriculture. You can see that the methods are pretty rudimentary and people are probably working very hard, probably not earning very much income. And yet, exactly in the same country, a few hours away, you could be working in Jakarta, which is this picture on the left, where you can see that there are high rises. It's a city with a lot of business. You might have an entirely different life if you lived and worked there. So if we look at these 2 images, I think there's a lot of natural questions that come to mind. Would it be better off if you were one of these farmers living in rural Java to move to Jakarta? What would happen to your livelihood? What would happen to the probability of being in poverty? What might happen to the livelihoods of your kids or your children if they grew up in Jakarta instead of growing up in rural Java? However, if we look at these 2 images, we can probably also start to think that the story might not be that simple. So perhaps the reason that we see that people are earning so much more in Jakarta is that you're much more likely to have a high school education or a university degree. You might have to work many more hours. The cost of living might be much higher. You might find that the quality of your life is much more difficult in Jakarta rather than living in the rural areas. So there are lots and lots of natural questions, but I think the tension here is that these are 2 options for people to live within the same country. And we want to understand sort of 2 related questions. Would people be better off if they migrated? So for example, would the person who's currently living in this picture on the right in rural Java have a better life if they moved to the city? And if it is the case, once we've thought through the returns, once we thought through all of the amenity challenges, the utility challenges, if it is the case that we think that they would be better off living in Jakarta rather than Java, then what is it that keeps people still living in Java, rural Java, when they would have that option to migrate? So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at a framework to think through how to understand this first question. Would people be better off moving? And then also start to think about the second question. What evidence do we have that there are constraints that might stop people from moving? And if so, what might be the policy implications of trying to relax those constraints? Okay, and internal migration is one component of migration more broadly. Of course, the other really big component is thinking about people who cross international borders. And often when we think about migration, we might think much more about the international side than the internal side. And Dean Yang will be hosting next week's class that's going to focus and give the same sort of overview and go into details about the returns and experiences of people who migrate across countries. However, internal migration is important. Globally, 1 in 8 people are internal migrants, so they've moved outside of the region that they were born in. And this is 4 times as many people as people who migrate internationally. That's probably for obvious reasons. People it's much easier to move within your own country. And people often have this tendency to move places that are closer to where they start. However, even though people have this option to move within their own country, we still see really large evidence of wage gaps. So looking at the average income that someone earns in the rural sector, at the average income that someone earns in the urban sector, the income gap is about 2.2 to 2.6 times on average across low-income countries. That's even after making adjustments for things like education, hours worked, trying to adjust for different costs of living. So this really large potential productivity gap is going to raise a lot of questions. If people could double their income just by moving to the urban area, then that as a poverty alleviation strategy is surely going to be substantial and have a really high rate of return relative to lots of the other policies that we might start to think about with poverty alleviation. So what we want to understand is this productivity gap actually an exploitable productivity gap? Or is it perhaps the case that although on average we see these big wage gaps across space, that doesn't mean that this policy idea of helping someone who's currently maybe inside a rural area move to an urban area would generate positive returns for that person? Okay, so what we're going to do today, we'll talk about this. I'm going to start by thinking about just setting the scene with some facts about both these wage gaps across space and also about different propensities to migrate. And then I want to go through the basic framework that we're going to use to think about what are all of the different components that people take into account when they migrate. We'll talk through sort of the empirical evidence for each of these components, and then talk about a few model extensions. The model extensions are going to be really interesting because these are exactly going to be the topics where we focus the rest of the classes over the forthcoming 4 weeks. We're going to talk a little bit about the migration module, and then I'll conclude my part and hand over to Travis, who's going to talk about his work running an RCT on helping people understand potential information frictions about exactly internal migration in Kenya. Okay, so let me go in and sort of start with this, setting the scene of what sort of magnitude we have of these wage gaps, and then how common is it for folks to migrate, and what do we see for people that we have data for. Okay, so this figure here is using the publicly available data from IPOMS for a collection of sub-Saharan African, primarily sub-Saharan African, a few African countries, just to tab what is the probability that the head of the household is living outside the region that they were born in. So what you can see here, there's a lot of different countries, different years, and the other thing to just remember is that a region or a district might be a different sized object in different countries. But what you can see is that migration rates are pretty large and pretty prevalent across this sample of countries. So you can see, for example, that in Malawi, 45% of heads of households report living in 2008 outside the district where they were born. You can look, for example, at Ghana, where that number is about 30, Tanzania, where that number is about 25. So you can see really high rates of migration. We talked at the start about the income gaps across space. So here is a map of the income gaps across space in Tanzania, thinking about average income that people might earn depending where in the country they live. So this hasn't started adjusting for any of these selection effects that are really important. But what's really striking when you look at this picture is that you can see on average, people are earning about $700, $800. However, the gap between the average income if you're living at the 90th percentile versus the average income if you're living at the 10th percentile is about 430%. So that's what this picture on the left is showing. It's just showing the distribution where we've taken average income by district, and the two red lines are the 10th percentile of that distribution and the 90th percentile of that distribution. And then the picture or the map on the right-hand side is just showing that spatial variation. So these questions sort of ask, naturally, there's a lot of people who are living in places where they're earning very low income relative to living in another location in the same country where they might be able to earn substantially more. This is not just a phenomenon that we see in low-income countries. These two figures here are from Moretti's handbook chapter. And they're showing the spatial distribution of wages in the US. So here it's a similar sort of picture where what we're looking at metropolitan areas and we're plotting the average wage. The top picture has the average wage for folks who've graduated high school. And the bottom picture has the average wage of people that have graduated college. And again, you see this pattern of dispersion where you see that it's not the case that everyone is earning the same income everywhere in the country. So that naturally leads a question, would it be better for people who are living and working in these lower income parts of the country to move to higher income parts? And then the last setting the scene figure I wanted to give is a lot of the time we talk about these moves as being from rural areas to urban areas. However, there's a substantial amount of migration that happens where people are moving from one rural area to another rural area, or they might be moving from one urban area to another urban area. So this table here is from a paper that I have with Garrett Bryan, where what we show is, again, this is using measures of migration defined by whether or not you're living outside the regency or the district that you were born in. You can see that we see about 30% of people who were born in rural areas are migrating, about 35% of people who were born in urban areas migrating, but about 30% of the rural moves are going to go to places where there are they're going to go to other rural locations. And about 75% of people who are migrating when they start in urban areas are going to migrate to another part of this country, which is also an urban area. So what does this mean? This means that we're going to need to keep track of lots of different dimensions of migration. So there could be this dimension of rural to urban moves. And if you look at just the rural to urban moves, you're going to get obviously a lower number because you're going to miss the people that are moving within sector. We're also going to potentially want to think about the duration or the time of migration. So people who move relative to where they were born versus people who move on a year-to-year basis, who might be doing temporary moves or short-term moves. So these are the numbers here for Indonesia for birth migration. If you look, for example, at a number that's annualizing the rate of migration on average from rural to urban areas, you see that number is about 1.1% for adults. Okay, so there's a lot here to think about. And what we see is that this sort of these two facts where there's a lot of dispersion in wages, there is a lot of migration, but there's potential questions about whether or not we should encourage more migration. So before I go into the model, I might give people a break there to ask any questions about the data so far.
So we've got one question so far. Can people be living outside region of birth half of the year?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and it comes back to this last point about what do we mean by the duration of migration and how do we measure it. So a lot of the census style questions ask about a point in time. So they might survey you, where are you living at this point in time relative to where you were born? And so in that case, what we would be picking up is we'd be picking up both permanent migrants and temporary migrants. Other question is ask more specific modules about whether or not you make short-term migration moves. So for example, the NSS survey in India is going to ask about moves of a duration less than or more than 6 months long. And so you might survey someone who's living back in a rural area, but you might see that they've been living away for some time. The idea of seasonal migration is also going to be very common and very important. And we'll talk a little bit more in Mushfiq's class. He's going to give a class on risk that will talk in particular about seasonal migration. And that's exactly this phenomenon where people are migrating for part of the year, coming back. That's going to sometimes be picked up in surveys and sometimes not, depending on how likely it is that the temporary migrants would be in the sample frame, for example, for a census, if you measure them there. So I think what we're going to do here is we're going to think about an umbrella model for migration. But as we talk about that, you might think about which components might be more or less important depending on the specific type of migration that we're thinking about. Yeah.
Okay, we've got another question. How much of, for example, the rural to rural migration consists of migration upon marriage, i.e. moving to the region of one's spouse?
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question. This table here is tabbing just males. Sometimes for this reason, I think migration marriage is particularly interesting in and of itself. However, when we're thinking about things like wage gaps, it may not be natural, although it could definitely be a possibility that people are also migrating based on returns to income. And in fact, we'll talk a little bit about, an example of a paper that thinks exactly about spreading out or diversifying the family by thinking about maybe you could send out or marry daughters to more spatially diverse locations to try and give your family more insurance. So these numbers here are looking at male heads of households. So I think the migration, marriage for migration is really important, especially for women. Women tend to migrate at much lower rates than men for labor migration, although we're not going to look too particularly at that in today's class, because we'll focus on lots of economic goals, but I'll give a couple of references if you're interested in that.
Okay, a couple more that we have. In the Brian and Morten table shown, about 15 to 25% of urban residents migrate to rural areas. While less common, this still seems surprising. Can you provide some intuition on why and how this happens?
Yeah, so I think one thing that's really interesting, and let me sort of, I'm giving these more just to set the scene and help to generate a lot of questions. When you actually look at the overlap in the income distribution, there's a substantial amount of overlap in rural and urban income distributions. So when we think about rural areas, you could think about areas where there might be, for example, mining, there might be like quite lucrative primary sector work, and people in those areas might actually be earning quite a lot, even though they're going to be classified as rural areas. So when you look at, for example, if you look at I haven't got the tables here in the talk, but if you look at the income distributions here and you plot what is the average distribution of earnings in rural areas and urban areas, there are some rural areas which are going to have higher average earnings than urban areas. On average, urban areas earn more, but the distributions have substantial overlap. And the second part of that is also going to be thinking about the role of comparative advantage. What kind of migrants might be good at working in other agriculture areas? It might be if you yourself have those skills, that you have a comparative advantage about working in another agricultural area, another rural area, that may be the better place to move than moving to an urban area. So the goal here is just to sort of show there's a lot of interesting facts. We're going to often think about condensing the migration decision to something like rural to urban. But if we want to think more broadly about a spatial component of that, there are 25 different locations. They might all have different characteristics. We can sometimes get quite a lot of rich insight about what the variation is even within a country. So I think what I might do now is the last question there. These numbers here, the difference between the 30% and the 1% is people who are moved relative to where they were born. So that's going to be kind of a stock of migration. The 1.1% is an annualized flow rate. How many people moved this year relative to last year? And then the second reason that 1.1% number is lower is that that's just thinking about the net rural to urban. So for example, within urban or within rural moves are going to get missed out on that definition. Okay, so let me keep going. So I want to start to think about how do we put these, what evidence do we have for what and how people make decisions? And, how do we start to think about this question of, is the migration rate too low, or is it perhaps just right and everyone is already making the efficient decision about where to live, where to work? Okay. So I'm going to use a simple model. This model is going to be basically the model that you would use if you wanted to start analyzing spatial equilibrium. So it's called the Rosen-Roback model. We're going to just think about these things being in partial equilibrium. But the natural next set of questions, once we've understood, how much do people care about wages? How much do people care about the cost of living? Is to think about how does the economy adjust when some of these events change? So in other words, if you build a new road and there might be a reduction in migration costs, how does that span and filter through all of the economy, taking into account that as people move, wages might change, house prices might go up, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we're not going to talk too much about the general equilibrium component of the model today, but just looking at this equation, you can sort of see that if we take these as static objects, we can think about the migration elasticity, for example, to wages. And if we want to think about the economic response in the aggregate, we would also want to start to think about how these quantities adjust in general equilibrium. So people are going to migrate, and this is going to be a sort of a starting point. People are going to migrate. They're going to want to migrate if they can earn more money. So then migration might depend on the wage in the destination. People are probably going to want to take into account the real wage. So you want to think about differential costs of living. So if the cost of living is higher, that might be reducing the real wage. There might be differential amenities. So for example, perhaps the city is got lots of cultural events, or perhaps the city has got a lot of pollution. So these amenities might be important to think about for factoring in for the migration decision. And then the last component is going to be whether or not there are costs, whether these costs are financial costs, or perhaps disutility costs from moving. That might mean that even though you might have a positive return in terms of net income, you may not still enjoy migrating, and so that's why you choose not to do it. Okay, so let's look at these components sort of one by one. I want to give a little bit of evidence about what we know about the reason that, for example, wages are important for migration. And then sort of flag also, there's a lot of really exciting research. For example, Travis is going to talk about his RCT, where there's lots of really innovative fieldwork that's happening exactly to try and get through some of these really challenging selection problems that are going to be sort of right at the forefront as we start to talk about any of these issues. Okay, so the first one is, let's think about wages. So I already showed you big dispersion and lots of evidence that there are wage gaps across countries. So sort of the number to keep in mind is that on average, the gap between average earnings in the rural and the urban area is normally about a factor of 2 within the same country. Okay, once you make a lot of adjustments, so you try to think about taking out controlling for education, controlling for observables, controlling for hours worked, things like that, you can reduce that gap, but you still end up usually with a gap that's at least about 1.5. However, what we might obviously want to think about is not just what are the observed wages, even controlling for observable characteristics, but we want to think about the kind of policy relevant number. What would happen if we facilitated the migration of one more person to move from where they are to somewhere else? Would that particular person have a positive return from migrating? And there we want to think about both selection on observables, but also potentially selection on unobservables. And there's going to be therefore a range of estimates, and I'll sort of talk through some of these different numbers that try and ask this question: what would be the wage premium of migrating? And a lot of this work is going to try to think about the rural to urban migration premiums. That's going to be the numbers that I show you now. But you can think about this in general, maybe what's the return of migrating from one city to another city? And this is really going to be one of the core numbers, because if all of these differences are driven by selection, whether or not it's selection on observables, like education, or selection on your own idiosyncratic individual match for working in the city, then that's going to have really big implications for whether or not migration is a potentially profitable way to think about reducing poverty. Okay, so let's think a little bit about what do we learn from thinking about looking at wage gaps, perhaps with lots of controls. What do we learn about thinking about event studies of migration? So what happens with the same person once they move? That's essentially thinking about the within individual or the individual fixed effects estimates. And then thinking about what kind of experimental evidence do we have about the wage returns to migration. Okay. And here again, the selection issues are really important to kind of keep in mind. So if we just think about on average, what are the earnings of people in rural areas versus urban areas? We're going to have any urban rural wage premium plus the average selection effects for people who are in rural areas right now and people who are in urban areas right now. If we look at what happens to the same person as they change location, what we're going to see is we're going to see the within person move. However, that may or may not end up being as informative about this policy relevant number, which is what would happen to the person that hasn't migrated, because we need to think in what is it that caused that person to move in the first place. So people are going to migrate both on their migration returns and taking into account their costs. So if someone has a very high return to migration, but perhaps faces a really high cost, perhaps it's really difficult for women to go and work and migrate to the city, for example. But if they did, they would have really high returns. We're never going to be able to measure this counterfactual return if the costs are stopping people from migrating, and therefore they're never observed in the data. The other sort of factor to think about is going to be to think about whether or not the heterogeneity at the individual level is a permanent characteristic, or whether or not, for example, the reason that you migrate is that you had a bad temporary shock. So any return might look positive because you've had a negative shock that spurred you to migrate. So the gap is going to look positive, even though the reason you migrated might be because you had a bad shock. And so part of what we're picking up is the response to a negative temporary shock, not a permanent average change in income. So let me talk a little bit on the next 2 slides about some observational studies. And then, of course, the gold standard would be to think about randomizing migration. Travis is going to talk about his work that does exactly that, so I won't talk too much about that. And then Mushfiq is going to talk in his lecture on risk about their experiment to randomize seasonal migration in Bangladesh. And just to sort of keep in mind the sort of magnitude here and why it might be important, Mushfiq is in the Bangladeshi case, they're going to find experimental returns to migration of about 36%. If you ran the same regression, just thinking about within person changes, you get a number closer to 9%. Okay, so there are going to be some cases where, although we can learn a lot from thinking about what happens as people migrate and change, we may, in some cases, be under or overestimating this policy relevant number, which is what is the return for the person who hasn't yet migrated. So before I go into the next figures, I see a few questions. Okay, so there's a few questions here. The amount of schooling, and then talking a little bit about location-specific human capital. So location-specific human capital is really important. In the framework that I put up right now, that can be something that you can think of about an individual specific cost. I'm not going to talk too much about that today, but how that fits in is thinking about the idiosyncratic part of selection. And so, for example, you can look at the really nice paper by Lagagos and War on thinking about individual comparative advantage in rural versus urban sectors to think about thinking about the individual part. You could also look at the paper that I put the pictures up from Indonesia, where we think about the individual selection effects in Indonesia. The second question about education and schooling, we're going to think about, often we're going to think about migration being a decision. Often we think about adults who might have already completed their schooling. So that's exactly going to be, if we think about the wages, maybe the returns to living in urban areas, the wage benefit for education is different than the wage benefit for low education. That would be one of these key selection channels there that we go in. If we want to start thinking about whether or not people migrate to get education, it might be most relevant to think about, for example, what happens to children if their parents migrate and they have opportunities to get more education. And so here, what you can think about in this framework is that for an individual eye, you can think about comparing, given whatever education bundle they have, compare the wage that they would have at their origin and the wage that they would have at their destination. And so we're thinking sort of about a within person comparison. Okay, so what do we see about some of these observational returns? Let me just go through a couple of studies that have found sort of different results here. So the first one is a paper that looks in Indonesia, and it does a really nice exercise where it first starts thinking about for Indonesia, what are the agricultural productivity gaps? So what are the average rural urban gaps? And these are the 2 numbers here on the left-hand side. So you can see without any adjustments, on average, the gap is about 1.4. So 140% higher in urban areas than rural areas. And once you adjust for observable characteristics, you see that the gap is about 1.075, so about 110% higher average income if you live in the urban area than in the rural area. This is in Indonesia. If you then look at the IFLS, IFLS is a household level survey that has a really important panel component, which is great because you can follow the same person over time. And you can ask, what happens as people start to migrate? If you do the same exercise, again, the adjustments, the agricultural gaps are a little bit lower in household survey data. You see about 70% gains in income in the raw numbers and about 40% gains in income in the adjusted numbers. And then the key result of this paper is that once you put in individual fixed effects, these urban wage premiums drop substantially. So if you look at depending on earnings and wages, you can see that you're going from a raw gap of about 70% gain of going to an urban area to potentially just a 7% here. And if you look at rural urban, it's a statistically insignificant 3%. Okay, so this set of papers asks whether or not this individual level selection might be quantitatively important, because if part of the gap is driven exactly by individuals, then who have their own characteristics, that doesn't mean that these are going to scale up. These potentially really large gaps, 140% income gain to the migrant who hasn't lived. Okay, so here are one set of results for Indonesia. Here is a sort of second exercise that does something very conceptually similar. It's going to look at consumption instead of income as the outcome variable. There might be some reasons that consumption is slightly better to use as an outcome variable, because, for example, if we have people moving between self-employment and other employment, there might be different measurement issues. And so what you can see here, again, across 6 different settings where there's tracking panel survey, this table is plotting the average return to being in an urban area relative to being in a rural area. So you see that looking without putting in fixed effects first, you have gains of about 60%. So these are really substantial gains, right? Earning 60% more per year just from moving location would definitely be a very, very, very high return relative to almost any other policy that we have to think about reducing poverty. And then column 2 is showing that once you put in individual fixed effects, so you look at the same person who's moving from a rural to an urban area, here what you see is that the returns go down. That's true. But in this case, they stay substantially, they still are substantially high. So they're still between about 15 to 20%. So 15 to 20% return just from moving location. Again, if we think about that in relative magnitudes to what the return is to 1 more year of education, the cost of getting 1 more year of education, this makes migration still look as a really high return. However, as I sort of flagged before, what we need to think about is that we may learn something about the returns for people who are migrating, but these numbers need to be taken with a little bit of caution about assuming that those would be the returns for people who haven't migrated. So if it's the case that the costs of migration are correlated negatively with the returns, perhaps the people that are migrating first off are people who have low costs of migrating. That's why they can afford to migrate. But it doesn't mean if we change the migration costs that the person who wasn't already migrating would have the same number. And so that's going to be where the experimental results are going to be particularly useful. And again, as I sort of flagged, there's going to be this one study that's a really important study about subsidizing people to migrate in Bangladesh that we'll talk a lot about in a couple of weeks. And then Travis is going to talk about his experimental returns to giving folks information, where we'll be able to look exactly at thinking about this question about what happens when we change people's propensity to migrate. What are the returns for people who weren't already migrating? So there's a question about thinking about decisions about migrating for longer run outcomes. So thinking about, do people factor in migration for their children, also new networks and things like that? These are really important decisions. The sort of empirical fact that you see is that if children move earlier, they end up looking more like urban children, so they get more education. The benefits of, and you see this also in the US with, for example, the moving to opportunity experiments. The benefit of moving into a better neighborhood often is larger for the children rather than for the adults, because the children might have time exactly to get better schooling or to get different networks. So we're not going to talk too much about these intergenerational decisions of migration today, but there's a really big literature on that, and also some really interesting literature using, for example, the moving to opportunity shocks in the US, thinking in Iceland about volcanic eruptions that cause people to have to relocate. What did that do for the children compared with the adults? Okay, so let's think next about cost of living. So of course, so the sort of take home from wages is that the wage gaps are really large. Usually, especially in terms of consumption, they do survive individual fixed effects. However, conceptually, individual fixed effects may not be the right policy relevant measure for migration, and it's going to be much more informative to think about the returns to migration through RCTs. And there, what we see is, for example, in the Bangladeshi case, the experimental returns to migrating seasonally were about 35%. The second component is thinking about costs of living. So costs of living, for example, you move to the city, you might have a whole lot of new costs that you may not have when you are living in rural areas. So perhaps you have higher housing costs, higher food costs, you need to pay for things like transportation to commute around the city to work. And this is going to be important because the real wage and not the nominal wage is obviously going to be the one that factors into the decision to migrate. So here it's really interesting to think about the broad definition of what costs can be. So one example is a paper by David Atkin that's looking at the consumption patterns of migrants, depending about the type of food that they grew up with and the type of food that they're used to eating. So for example, if you grow up in an area where there's relatively a lot of rice, your diet is probably consumed more of rice, and you're used to cooking, you have recipes and you have knowledge and you might like that. If you end up moving to, for example, a different part of India where people are much more likely to eat wheat than rice, the challenge is that rice is going to be relatively more expensive. And so this paper sort of documents this caloric tax, the fact that people, as they move, one of the higher costs for them if they want to continue eating the food that they like is that the relative supply of food and the relative cost of that food might be different from where they're from. And so you can sort of see this as one component as well of the cost of migration. It can either be a cost of living component or it could be an idiosyncratic migration cost. When we make adjustments for thinking about the cost of living, what we see is that on average, the wage gaps are still there. So this is using data from India. This is a table from Munshi and Rosenzweig. What you can see here is sort of nominally, you can see that the wage gaps are about 60% higher in urban areas. Adjusting it reduces it slightly for consumption bundles, but you can still see that the gaps are sort of 25 to 35% higher going in urban areas. Okay. This is just looking at similar data from Brazil, where what we wanted to do is plot the spatial distribution of wages. So again, if it were the case that everyone was earning the same wage, we would see that there would be no distribution of wages across locations. The green one is showing the wage, thinking about just using raw levels. The red distribution here is plotting the distribution of wages across municipalities once we take out, for example, different housing costs and take out different characteristics of individuals and different industry effects. So you still see, in this case, about 170% higher wages between the 90th percentile and the 10th percentile. The unadjusted number is much, much larger. So the wage gaps are generally surviving cost of living adjustments. Okay. So the next component that we can think about is we can think about amenities. So people don't just want to earn income, although that's often a really important reason that they migrate. We might also want to think about whether or not they need to trade off the quality of their life in terms of what amenities they get when they're moving from rural to urban areas. And here, we often think about cities. Iglesias talks about the demons of density. So is it the case that we see cities having more pollution, more congestion, more crime? And does this mean that when we're thinking about one of the reasons that people might earn more in urban areas is it's a compensating differential for the fact that they have to live in an area which is not as pleasant to live in? Of course, you might be the sort of person that finds city amenities to be better than rural amenities. And so in that case, the compensating differential might be in the other direction. And here, I think the evidence about the role of amenities, especially in low-income countries, is a little bit mixed. So there is evidence that, for example, people are responsive to negative amenities like pollution. So what you see, for example, in Mexico is changes in pollution directly leads to changes in how much people are working. What you see in China is that people are willing to move away from a location that becomes more polluted. And interestingly, the migration elasticity seems to be larger for more skilled people than less skilled people. So what this means is that part of the pollution generating changes in migration patterns may also be changing the optimal allocation of high-skilled and low-skilled people across space, which might also end up having aggregate productivity effects in terms of thinking about, where are the best people to be working and how well are they matched. The counterexample to this is that there's a very nice paper by Doug Golan and co-authors who try and think systematically about all of the different measures of amenities that we could measure. So things both about, for example, access to healthcare, access to education, pollution, different private measures, different public measures. And the challenge is that often in low-income settings, these amenities end up being positively correlated with density instead of negatively correlated. So what does that mean? It means that in this paper, they don't find any evidence that cities are more dirty, for example, which means that the compensating wage differential argument that part of the reason you're paid more to live in a city is because of these negative amenities may not be the right explanation. Other studies do find evidence that cities, for example, have more pollution or that people are responsive and moving away from locations with pollution. So I think here there's a lot of sort of really interesting avenues for future work. The second important amenity effect, of course, might also be the role of networks and the role of just having friends and family. So perhaps one of the things that you get from living at home is that you get to see your friends and family. You could think of this as an idiosyncratic amenity. You could think of this also as perhaps an idiosyncratic cost of migrating. And we're going to think much more about the role of networks and the role of networks and understanding migration in the lecture that Kaivan Mushi is going to give in lecture 3. Okay, so maybe if are there any questions? Let me just stop there if there are any questions about amenities. Okay, so here is just a summary table. This is a summary table from a really nice review article by David Legagos, which is just sort of showing some of these other broader measures of quality of life. Again, you see these really big differentials between urban and rural areas. So for example, if you look in India, if you're living in a house with finished floors or having a toilet, for example, an urban area in India, that's 70% likely that you're living in a house with finished floors, relative to only 40% if you're in a rural area. So these big urban-rural gap, some of these amenities here are private amenities, but for example, if you think about mortality rates, these might measure average access to healthcare. You can see that the under 5 mortality is about twice as high in rural areas as in urban areas in both India and Nigeria. So these, I think, suggest that the theoretical role of amenities to be a compensating differential doesn't fully explain the fact that we still see really big positive wage gaps in cities. And it could suggest, if anything, that there might be complementary benefits of both having people move towards both higher wages and potentially higher amenities. Okay, and the last big component of that basic framework is thinking about whether or not there are costs to migration. And here, I think the cost of migration, we might want to think about, again, what is the type of migration that people are doing and what sort of costs are relevant for that type. So often we think about things like financial costs. You might need to pay for the bus ticket to migrate, the transportation to migrate. You might need to pay for upfront costs for accommodation, for food once you get to the destination. You might have some of these utility, or sometimes they're called psychic costs, which, you miss being away from your friends and family, you miss being away from a place where you might have easy access to familiar food or familiar culture. And these are all part of the bundle that make it that you don't want to move. And here, coming back to the idea about policy, we might want to think about which of these costs are potential policy relevant costs, and which of these costs are costs that are going to be hard to respond to. So for example, if people are optimally not migrating because they like being near their friends and family, that might mean that we do see positive returns to migrating. However, the utility returns to migrating are not positive. And it's not clear that there's a market imperfection there that we want to come in and somehow facilitate this through government policy. However, if it's the case that people don't have access to cash, and the reason that they're not migrating is because they don't have money to pay the upfront costs of migration, then that might be the case where there is a missing market, perhaps a missing credit market. And so that would be a scope for having a policy relevant intervention to try and facilitate migration. And here there are lots and lots of examples of costs of migration. So let me give a couple of specific ones that are to do with changes in migration after infrastructure improvements. But another really important set of migration restrictions, and there's a very, very large literature on this, is thinking about the role of hukou migration restrictions in China, where people essentially are able to migrate. However, they're not able to access any public goods if they're living in an area where they're not already registered. So for example, what does that mean? That might mean that if you are registered in a rural area, if you go and work in an urban area, you don't get access for your kids to go to school, you don't get access to healthcare. And so that's a migration cost, because the benefits of moving need to be large enough to compensate for the fact that you don't have these public health benefits that you would otherwise get. And again, we can think more broadly, as we might want to start thinking about the aggregate implications. What does these sorts of restrictions mean for whether or not individuals are earning the most amount of money that they can, and then whether or not the economy as a whole is producing as efficiently as it can, where it has the right match people living in the right match places. Okay, so let me give a couple of examples about some infrastructure changes that led to migration. And then again, there's sort of a really large literature looking at this. There's some really nice choice experiments in this paper by David Lagakos and co-authors, where they're trying to think about, how much of the migration costs, or the fact that people don't seem to migrate despite these really high returns, because, for example, they miss their friends and family, they might have differential access to sanitation facilities, there might be costs of not being able to come back and forward to see friends and family. And so again, these are rational decisions that people know that they could earn more money, but sometimes are choosing not to because they prefer to stay where they are. But let me give you a couple of examples about infrastructure. And then I want to sort of talk through a few extensions and flag what's going to be coming for the rest of the migration module. Okay, so the first example is thinking about building roads and whether or not facilitating road networks helps to speed up migration, or can allow people to migrate between places where there wasn't already as much migration. So this particular context is in Brazil. This is from a paper with Jacqueline Oliveira. And what you can see is here is a map in Brazil, just showing the spread of roads over time. So you can see basically in 1940, there are very few roads. What happens in 1960 is that there's a new capital city that's built in the middle of the country. And the road network starts to be built to connect this new capital city with all of the other existing cities around, primarily around the coast of Brazil. And you can see that the road network sort of spreads out. What we then show is that this picture on the left shows the change in average travel cost over time as related to where we predict the road should go if the goal is to connect the new capital city. What you can see is that there's not a pre-trend, there's no movement on connecting the future capital of Brazil, Brasilia, to the cities before Brazil is there. But after 1960, you see really sudden changes where the cost of going on roads goes down. And then again, you look at whether or not that facilitates migration. You see very little response in terms of migration beforehand. But as soon as the roads come in and the capital city is built, you see changes there in migration. The second example is it's not really an internal migration example, but it's an interesting example just to think about with infrastructure. This is thinking about whether or not building barriers along the US-Mexico border is going to be something that would change migration flows. So this is a paper with Trib Allen and Kawe Dobbin, where we look at a policy in 2006 that built 550 miles of fence. So there was mostly this, about half of it was this pedestrian fence on the left. Some of it was this type on the right. And then we ask, does building these physical barriers change the migration patterns of people who are migrating primarily without authorization. So we have some confidential administrative data looking at access to an identification card of Mexican migrants in the US. This screenshot here is just kind of interesting. It's a screenshot just to show you the scope of these barriers that were built. This is a screenshot of the wall between Mexico, which is in the south, and the US in the north. And this is just an hour from San Diego. And you can see here the barrier going along the border. And then it stops just after this small town. And when we looked at whether or not this changed migration flows, we see that making it more difficult to migrate did change migration flows. So that's what the picture here shows, that there's a reduction in new identification cards, which are a proxy for undocumented migration, and places that had a larger relative migration cost between the origin and destination saw a reduction in migration. However, in this case, people were very responsive on the intensive margin, but primarily all of that was just displacement, where they stopped going to one specific destination that got too costly, and instead they substituted and went to a different destination. So here we're measuring relative gain drops in migration. However, the absolute change in migration was much smaller because of the ability to substitute across destinations. Let me stop there and think about a couple of questions. So there's a question about the ethical point of view of migration restrictions. So I don't have a strong opinion about that, because I think it's unclear what the optimization policy is of that policy. But I think what we can look at, and what scholars have seen about hukou restrictions, is that the restrictions end up being binding because people can't move freely. Well, people can move, but they don't have access to the full range of public services. That does factor into their migration decisions. And the aggregate costs to the Chinese economy of having these hukou restrictions is substantial. The Chinese economy, on average, would have much higher income if it allowed people to migrate where they wanted to, or where they had a good match. So what we can answer based on the work that people have done is that there is an aggregate efficiency cost to having these restrictions. There's a question about work from home affected migration. I think there's a lot of interesting work in the US about work from home, although I think a lot of that is still quite an evolving situation, given that it may be a temporary shock or it may be a permanent shock. I think work from home in low-income countries is going to be a little bit less common, because most people are not having the sorts of occupations. Very, very few people are having the sorts of occupations where they would have work from home as we think about it as an option. And then there's a question about information about roads in Brazil. I think one challenge could be, as we connect locations with roads, both transportation costs go down, but for example, people have better information. In the Brazilian case, it's really difficult to disentangle those, but in particular about the role of information, Travis is going to give us a really some really interesting insight into his experiment that he ran, thinking a little bit where he can isolate exactly the information costs to give us a sense there. Okay, so let me flag a couple of really interesting extensions. Mostly I wanted to do these just to flag the future work that's coming in this module. So the first one is that the very simple model I gave was thinking about an individual making decisions. Of course, it might not be that one individual person is making individual decisions. It might be the case that the family as a whole is deciding where to migrate, all of the different members. And this is the reference for the marriage paper, where I talked about evidence that one way that you might sort of see that the decision is bigger than just an individual is that households might strategically be thinking about, for example, where to have daughters migrate to through marriage, to kind of generate insurance through migration schemes. So this is going to be really important for thinking about the role of remittances, and remittances are going to get covered in lecture 2. There's a lot, and we had a couple of questions about networks and potential informal insurance. Networks and informal insurance might be a reason why people don't want to move, because they have really good insurance at home that they might have to give up. Or networks might be something that facilitates migration, because people who are having friends and family in the destination might find it easier to find jobs, so they might find it easier to get housing. And so again, that's going to be we're going to have a whole lecture on migration and networks in lecture 3. And then the second, another really important component is that thinking about, we might not just think about the average returns, we might want to think about the risk and the uncertainty. This comes back to the sort of seminal model of Harris and Todaro. And we're going to have, again, a whole lecture on risk. And then another really important policy implication is thinking about, for example, the role of imperfect property rights. You know, what do we see about other markets that might be imperfect? For example, whether or not you can keep your land if you migrate, that might also affect the decision. Okay. So I think, as we talked about the individual partial equilibrium returns to migrating, you can do exactly the same exercise to think through the aggregate ones. I'm going to just skip these 2 slides in the interest of time, but there's a little bit there. And in fact, that would be easily the topic of a much larger lecture. So I just wanted to flag that there's another whole literature that tries to look and ask exactly at these aggregate questions. And then again, let me just flag, I can sort of talk briefly about what's coming, but we're going to hear in a few minutes from Travis. Travis is going to talk about information frictions and talk about some experimental results to rural-urban migration. Next class, we're going to have a class on international migration with Dean Yang and a featured speaker, Awad Garov. We're going to then talk about networks, and we're going to have Joshua and Maria talk about some of their work to supplement the networks. We're going to talk about risk and the migration risk. And again, we're going to have 2 featured speakers to highlight some of their work that's focused on risk. And then we're going to close up our migration session with a really important session on thinking about the policy implications of what we've talked about with migration. That's going to be with David McKenzie, who's going to talk through, you know, what do all of these different estimates about returns to migration actually mean for whether or not we should be facilitating migration? If so, how do we facilitate migration? Okay, so to wrap up my part and then hand over to Travis, the big puzzle is that we see a lot of wage dispersion and really large wage gaps, even within countries. Experimentally, the returns to migration are large. And so there's a very large open set of questions about what exactly is it that's stopping people from migrating more? And if so, what kind of policies would be relevant to help facilitate that? And then sort of diving more deeply in here, you know, what are the models that we need to think about measuring selection? What are the models that we need to think about understanding the aggregate implications of migration? And we're going to see exactly more of this over the next 4 weeks. So let me hand over to Travis, and then we should have a few minutes at the end to do any kind of last questions, but please also talk to Travis and ask questions in Travis as we go through.
Okay, hi everyone. I'll assume that you can hear me and see me and see the slides unless somebody tells me otherwise. So I'm Travis Baseler. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Rochester, and very happy to be here talking to you today. You've got a very exciting set of modules coming up, and so lots to look forward to. So I'm going to talk today about the role of information in internal migration. You know, as you've already learned about in today's lecture, some of the big questions surrounding internal migration in low-income countries are about understanding the nature of these spatial gaps in income, which are really quite big relative to the same gaps in richer countries, and which generally don't disappear when you control for these observable worker characteristics. So if these gaps persist because of barriers to migration, then there's potentially room for policy to improve welfare by targeting those barriers. But then, of course, in that case, it's going to be very important to understand precisely what those barriers are. So researchers have approached these questions in different ways. One approach is to model the selection process explicitly to try to understand the extent to which selection can explain the gaps. A different approach is to identify barriers to migration, which, when mitigated, change migration decisions, and then hopefully also improve economic outcomes. So that literature has focused largely on financial constraints, land market imperfections, transportation costs, and information, whether information about the process of migrating or information about opportunities in the destination relative to the origin. So my talk is going to focus just on the information side of things, since that's where some of my own work has been. Okay, when we think about why information might matter for migration behavior, remember that people make decisions based on perceived costs and benefits rather than true costs and benefits. And economists have found that people do lack information in a way that matters for their health decisions and their education decisions. It turns out that people also lack information about potential income in other countries, at least in the case of Tongans considering migrating to New Zealand, who quite dramatically underestimate incomes at the destination, which they could be earning. And that's a result that comes out of this very nice Mackenzie, Gibson, and Stillman paper, which is able to exploit a randomized migration lottery for Tongans who want to migrate to New Zealand, and can compare the actual incomes of winners of the lottery to the perceived potential incomes of non-winners of the lottery, and they find quite substantial underestimation there. But it's ex ante a little bit less clear that people would have bad information about opportunities within their own country than about opportunities in other countries. Okay, so when we think about why people might lack information, one reason is that maybe they don't care. They don't think about it, right? I mean, there's so much information in the world, and a lot of it is going to have no bearing on your life at all. As an example, imagine somebody asks me how much corporate lawyers earn in New York City. I could guess, but I'd probably be way off. But in a sense, it doesn't matter at all that I'm wrong about that. It doesn't matter that I lack information about that parameter, because I know I'm never going to be a corporate lawyer, so I don't really care how much they earn, right? It's certainly not going to affect my decision about whether to migrate to New York City or not. Another reason that people might lack information is maybe they have biased sources. So maybe people are forming their beliefs based on a proxy that either over or underestimates the true parameter. Okay, or maybe people do have good sources, but they're bad at aggregating, right? They're reluctant to move their priors, maybe because of some behavioral mechanism, or maybe they put excess weight on outlier stories like really amazing successes or really bad failures. Today, I'm going to show you that people do have biased sources that they rely on to learn about the returns to migration. And we'll also think a little bit about why people might not correct for that bias, even when they know about it in principle. Okay, but first, some motivating facts. So these are data that I collected from people in rural Kenya. I asked them what they thought people were earning in different cities in their country within Kenya. I've put low-wage cities on the left here and high-wage cities on the right. Nairobi on the far right is the capital and the biggest city in Kenya. And then I can compare people's answers, or the average answer, to representative data on actual incomes in those cities. And I'm going to normalize everything based on a nearby reference town that people are quite familiar with. And so what do you see when you compare the light bars showing people's average belief and the dark bars showing the actual incomes in those cities, is that people are pretty close on some of the low-wage cities, but quite far off on 2 of the higher-wage cities. And that doesn't change much when I deflate things by a price index. So trying to convert those nominal incomes to real incomes. Now, even more interestingly, I think it turns out that people don't even have good information about the incomes of migrants from their own household. So take a look first at the chart on the right. This shows data from migrants and from those migrants' parents back home. Okay, so rural to urban migrants, and then their parents living back in the rural village. Both of whom I ask the same question. I say, how much was the migrant earning during some fixed common time interval? And you can see that the migrants report in the dark bar, they're saying that they earn a lot more than their parents think they're earning here in the light bar. Look on the left, I can repeat that process, not for migrants, but for people working in the same village as their parents. I see no difference on average. Okay, so this is really a migrant-specific phenomenon. So this invites a question. Does a lack of information matter for migration? So I designed an RCT to test this question. I was working with households in rural Kenya in these blue shaded regions here. And the treatment that the treated households got basically consisted of report cards on various urban labor markets in Kenya. So these report cards shared information on average incomes, common jobs for migrants, the share of migrants employed in a given period, some information on local prices, all taken from representative surveys run within Kenya. Now, I'm going to jump straight to the results. So these are regressions of various outcomes on a treatment dummy. Okay. What we see is that information changes beliefs, quite rapidly. So these are measures taken right after people got the information. And what you can see is that people are more likely to say that they would migrate to Nairobi, the capital. They think that they would earn more there if they moved. Okay, so their perceived potential own income increases. And they update on the sorts of jobs that they could work if they were to move to Nairobi. So I follow households over 2 years. And what I find is more migration to Nairobi out of treated households. So you can see in the first row here, over 2 years, the number of people traveling to Nairobi goes up by about 1/3 relative to the control group. The second row shows you that they're finding jobs in Nairobi. So the coefficients on employment are about the same as the coefficients on migration overall. Okay, and then in the third row, you can see there's a noisy but positive effect on overall employment, suggesting that some of the employment effect is maybe coming out of unemployment. So people finding jobs in Nairobi that they wouldn't have found if they had stayed back home. So maybe transitioning out of just working on the farm into more stable employment. Okay, and then finally at the bottom, you can see that the information is inducing switching out of agriculture into non-agriculture. And that's where some of the really big gaps across space are driven by, is differences between non-agricultural wages and agricultural wages. Okay, so I also look at reported income, and that's quite a bit higher in treatment. So these coefficients are coming from what are called ANCOVA regressions, meaning that I'm going to stack all of the post-treatment observations and then control for a time fixed effect, control for any pre-treatment differences. So those are netted out. Treated households are reporting income that's about 23% higher. And this is driven entirely by income earned in Nairobi. Okay, I also see effects at the origin on some more real outcomes. So these, this is nominal income, but I look at also whether the household reports that its finances are in a pretty good state. That's higher in treatment. And I look at an index of mental health, and that's higher in treatment. That suggests to me that there are some real improvements in well-being coming out of improved access to these higher urban earning opportunities. So I want to turn now to the question of why people lack information, but let me quickly check the chat box. Yes, so okay, great. So you've anticipated exactly where this is going. So I'm going to get into that right now. And then to the other question, no, this was an information provision experiment only. Households didn't get anything else. You might think that the joint effect of financial facilitation and information might be even higher if some households are facing multiple barriers at once, which is plausible. But I'm going to show you, in fact, as you saw already, information alone was enough to change behavior. Okay, so why does a simple information treatment like this one change behavior? How can it be that people didn't have this information from the get-go? So I'm going to focus on a story about hidden income, meaning income earned by migrants that is not observed by members of their rural social network. Okay, it's hidden, it's not reported. A key motivating factor here is going to be remittances. So if my family thinks I'm earning a lot of money, maybe they're going to ask me for more, right? Ask me to send them back more money. And I'm going to show you a model here because a challenge that we'll run up against if we want to use hidden income to explain low beliefs is that, like, most people are not fools, right? They know that migrants face these underreporting incentives. And so the role of the model is going to be to show you how even sophisticated people who are sort of running some Bayesian updating process in their mind to think about what urban incomes are can end up reaching the wrong conclusion when they have to update over two parameters at once. So they don't know urban incomes, and they don't know whether their migrant is reporting honestly or not. Okay, so here's the setup. So think about an urban migrant earning some income Y, drawn from some distribution F. That migrant will send a report of his income to his rural family. Let's call that report S. And then he has to remit a share kappa of that report back home. His problem then is to choose a report that maximizes his income minus this lying penalty term, which is increasing in the gap between Y and S. Think about that as maybe either a psychic cost, you feel bad lying, or maybe there's a sort of a threat if my family finds out that I'm lying, which is increasing obviously in how severe the lie is. And then finally minus remittances. Okay, but we're going to have two types of migrants, and this is going to be crucial. Honest migrants, which I'll denote with alpha equals 1, don't internalize the effect of the signal on remittances. So this latter term here just disappears. But then strategic migrants with alpha equals 0 do. Okay, so we're going to get a unique solution for each type. Honest migrants are going to report the truth always. Strategic migrants are going to deflate the truth by this kappa over phi term. So, one quick, but I think sort of interesting result is that the rural household, from its perspective, it doesn't need to know anything about the urban income distribution F to recover the migrant's true income from the signal. All it needs to know are the parameters of the migrant's utility function, right? If it knows phi, kappa, and alpha, then you give it an S and it can figure out what the Y is, even if it knows nothing about urban incomes, right? But of course, the interesting case is going to come about when the family doesn't know the migrant's type. So they don't know if their migrant is strategic or honest. They just maybe have some prior belief over that probability. And they also don't know the mean of the urban income distribution, but they do have some prior mu hat. Okay, so then for any report the family gets, say that the migrant sends them a low report. The migrant says, things are tough. I'm not earning very much. Sorry, I can't send you very much money. The family doesn't know whether that report was generated by an actually low income reported honestly, or an actually high income that's then been deflated down, right, strategically. What's maybe surprising, certainly was surprising to me about this model, is that beliefs in the limit, so the rural family's beliefs about urban income are going to be random, depending on their initial priors and depending on random fluctuations in the migrant's income process, especially toward the beginning of the series. If you've ever learned, maybe in a mathematics class, the pollia urn problem, which is where you pull a colored ball from an urn and then you replace the ball you took plus another ball of the same color as the one you drew, this problem turns out to share a lot of features with that pollia urn problem, where the limiting distribution of the ball colors in the urn depends on the initial distribution and also on which colors happen to be randomly drawn toward the beginning. But it's going to be a random limiting distribution. So here is an example of how beliefs change given a series of reports from the migrant. So I've normalized 1 here to be the average income and 0 to be the average lie. And we're going to look at a strategic migrant here, right, who's always deflating his income by this kappa over phi. Okay, so the household has some prior beliefs over whether the migrant is honest. That's going to be shown in green, and also priors over mean income in the city. That's shown in purple. So I'm going to run this, and what you can see is that the stochastic income series in blue here, the stochastic income series in blue, and then the co-moving reports in yellow, right, are the migrant's income and the migrant's signal. And what's going on? So look at what happens to beliefs in the city. They converge down toward the lie. Why? Because early on, the household's prior is closer to the early reports than to the true income. So the migrant looks to be reporting honestly. So then the household updates its belief about the probability that the migrant is honest. Now, eventually, once the household has decided that the migrant is honest, then urban incomes are just going to, beliefs about urban incomes are going to converge to the lie, because the household is just performing simple Bayesian updating on this series of lies here. So this chart shows how those limiting beliefs depend on 2 priors. So as you move to the right, so the higher the household's prior about urban income, right, whether they think it's high or low at the outset, maybe because they have better, outside information about the city, maybe they've been there themselves, or they know somebody else who's reporting honestly. And as you move down, so the more skeptical the household is of the migrant's reports early on, the more likely beliefs are to converge to the true mean income, which in these simulations is 10. Okay, upper left, the less skeptical the household early on, and the lower its prior belief about urban income, the more likely beliefs are to converge to the average lie. Okay, so I'm going to show you now some evidence that the assumptions of the model are a pretty good fit for this context in Kenya. Let me again pause though and just check the Q&A. So about the control mean in agriculture, that wasn't a share, that was a number. So that's why it's a number of people per household. So that's why it's higher than 1. And then in terms of sample selection, So these were selected from, a couple rural counties in Kenya in a systematic way, because you sort of want to avoid sampling bias as much as you can, but we didn't draw them randomly from administrative lists or something. So it's possible that the households selected were slightly different than average households. I can run an exercise where I compare people in my sample to the population drawn from the census, which is supposed to be a representative sample, and they really don't look that different. So I don't think that you should think of these households as dramatically different from average households. They're certainly not high migration propensity along any dimension that I can see, but I can't fully rule that out for sure. Okay, so what I'm showing you here are data that pair migrants and their sending rural household. I ask the household, how good is your information about migrant incomes? You can see there's some variation with over half of people saying, yeah, I have pretty good information. So then I ask migrants the analogous question. I say, do people back home know your income? And there's much less variation, right? Basically, everybody's saying, no, people don't know how much I earn. So, what's going on here is some households think they have good information, right? Their beliefs have converged, but they probably don't. At least according to the migrants, they don't. Next, I ask the migrants, okay, if your family did know how much you were earning, would they ask you for more money? And basically everybody says yes, right? Which tells me that migrants are thinking about these strategic incentives. So I run some more formal tests where I check whether households have worse information about migrant earnings when the migrant's incentive to misreport is stronger, and I find that indeed they do. So here a low value indicates underestimation, and I'm splitting by low versus high incentive to underreport in the dark and the light bars. And so I find that parents who think migrants should remit a lot, so think kappa is high, have worse information. They underestimate the migrant's income more severely. When migrants say that, okay, if I convinced my sibling to come to the city, my remittances wouldn't really go down, they would stay the same. Though the parents of those migrants have worse information, they underestimate more. And then within a migrant social network, the better you know the migrant's parents, the worse information you have about the migrant's income, the more you underestimate that income. And then the right just shows a placebo on that first dimension, the expected remittance share, and there's no difference at all for non-migrants. Okay, so the last piece then is testing whether hidden income affects people's beliefs about how much they could be earning in the city. So another way to put that is the biased source, the migrant reports, being used to inform people's beliefs about urban incomes? And so I'm going to be quick here in the interest of time and just kind of summarize the results of a second RCT, which tests this by randomly shocking people's beliefs about hidden income by sharing information on the average share of income remitted by migrants living in Nairobi. That's a statistic that people overestimate by quite a bit on average. And indeed, I find that correcting this belief leads people to update positively on how much they could earn in Nairobi, but only if they haven't been to Nairobi themselves. That's the key piece, which suggests to me that people with good outside information, there are some of these people, they don't need to rely on migrant reports, or maybe they have a better sense of the extent of income hiding, but that there are people with poorer outside information who are relying on these reports. Let me wrap up. So there's one small but sort of potentially, in some cases, important implication around measurement. So if household members are hiding income from each other, and I'm not the first to document that, other papers have found similar results, many other papers. For example, the Chakela and Ozier Rottenkin theorem paper also done in Kenya. In that case, then asking household heads to report, especially migrant income, or asking the migrant to report their income to a surveyor in the presence of the household head might not produce reliable results. Better to survey the migrant directly and in private if possible. Okay, and then, like with any study, it's important to ask yourself the question, how generalizable do you think the results are? And in this case, I think the answer is likely to hinge on at least three things. So whether there are spatial gaps, right? Spatial gaps vary quite a bit at the country level. And if there aren't big spatial gaps, then it's probably going to be harder to sustain hidden income. Two, whether there are strong remittance expectations. If not, then the incentive to underreport income is just not going to be as strong. Okay, and then maybe also how prevalent migration is. Maybe once there's a lot of migration out of an area, then it sort of becomes harder to sustain hidden income. And I'm actually in the process of scaling up this project right now, launching this summer, also in Kenya, and I'll certainly be thinking about these generalizability questions, right? So asking under what circumstances people do lack information, as well as combining the information treatment I showed you today, which is very general, right? It's basically about first moments of the urban income distribution, about some basic descriptive statistics of labor markets, combining that with a program that targets local information frictions. So once you get to the city, knowing that incomes is high might not be enough. I mean, you might not know exactly where the right places are to look for jobs, where the right places are to find affordable but safe housing. So we'll be pairing people with established former migrants currently living in the city who will act as local guides, and see if that helps them overcome some of those more local information frictions. Okay, and then also testing whether maybe treating a lot of people at once, so creating common knowledge, makes it easier for households to coordinate these trips, which might help them overcome barriers too. Okay, so that is all. Thank you all so much for your time. I always appreciate comments and questions if you have any, whether in the next 7 minutes or if you think of one afterward, just shoot me an email. But I'll stop there, and we can take more questions either about the content that Melanie went over or about my own stuff here.
Yeah, so I think just to sort of flag up, we have about 5 more minutes of our class. So I think, Travis, there are a couple of questions there about this paper. Let's start with those. But if anyone has any last questions about anything that we've talked about today, we have a few minutes now to kind of do a Q&A to wrap up the session, and then have you ready for international migration next week. But Travis, why don't you take it away with these ones in the chat for now?
Right. So Sakina, good question about whether the family is learning only from its own migrant or from other sources as well. So the model is pretty simple, but you can think about that as being built into the prior, right? So some people might have very limited exposure to the city, and so maybe be forming their priors based on information about local labor markets where wages are much lower, or nearby towns where wages are typically much lower. Versus some people who maybe have personal experience in the city, and so have some more information built into that. So no, certainly people are not only learning from their own migrants, but in a way, you can think of that the income that the migrant from your household is earning as potentially being a very informative signal, to the extent that your characteristics might be similar to the characteristics of your siblings or something. We often find that education levels are quite correlated with a household, for example. And then, do I think that studying the impact of information provision to rural communities on host communities is worthy? Absolutely, right? So maybe experiments like mine or experiments like others are going to induce migration to urban areas from rural areas that might have all sorts of implications for the urban areas. There's, of course, a much broader literature in international migration that studies the impact of immigration on receiving countries. And there's a little bit of work too in the internal migration arena. That's not something that I was able to do, but there certainly is some work on that, and I agree that it's important.
Okay, well, Travis, I think that is a wonderful study, and it's really exciting also to hear about the follow-up work, thinking about scaling up, thinking about it, with all these questions, understanding how we can learn about external validity and about the contexts to help think about both on the theoretical framework and then coming back and looping back into policy is really important. It looks like there's one more question, Travis. Let me just ask it to you.
Yeah,
so is it impossible? Is it also possible that the family hides the migrant members' information to avoid any signaling in the community?
Absolutely, yeah. So these income sharing arrangements do not exist only within households; they also exist across households, and there's an immense literature studying those as a form of insurance, basically. And so, indeed, you might think that a household, would be incentivized to not let other households in the village know if its migrant is earning a lot of money. And in fact, that's one of the pivotal assumptions of the Munshi and Rosenzweig paper that studies the interaction between insurance networks and migration in India. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, I would recommend looking at that paper. That's also one thing I'm thinking about in the scale up. So maybe, if these sort of incentives exist to not share information across households, then maybe treating lots of households at once could produce a different equilibrium, a different response than treating them one by one. And it's a small but kind of interesting point. So the project that I just showed you, treatment was randomized at the household level. And when you do something like that, you maybe worry about spillovers, right? The treated households are just going to tell the control households what they learned. And so then you won't find any difference after the fact. I have a couple strategies to look for that. I don't see much. And I think the reason might be exactly what you mentioned, that people prefer to keep this information to themselves rather than share it.
Okay, so thank you, everyone. I want to give another big thanks to all the folks at IGC for organizing this, also to all of the other co-presenters in our migration module. We've got a really exciting 5-week set of classes. And so we will see everyone back next week, where Dean Yang is going to talk about international migration and sort of think about some of these questions when we start thinking about people moving across countries. So thank you again, Travis, and thanks everyone for joining in. We'll have the lecture notes available, and I think the recordings will be available. And we'll look forward to seeing everyone next week. Thank you.